Oh, man. Oh, wow. Baby Queen, Sister Kara, I tell you, we are in for it this evening. How are you, first of all?
I, I was doing good. Now I'm doing well. very, very
Yes,
looking forward to this conversation. And
absolutely.
yep,
Absolutely. I, these indeed are interesting times. I think we both can agree. Let's see, this is our second broadcast, our second live stream for 2024. And so we eased into it. Um, but I think this evening we're about to really begin the new year off with a real bang. And these really are indeed interesting times, in the sense that I'm hearing from colleagues from around the nation, um, African American women, women of African descent working in higher ed, not just as university or college presidents, but as women of color in higher ed in very prominent or significant positions who are experiencing much of or similar situations as Dr. Claudine Gay, who we're here to focus on this evening. But all of that to say that these are interesting times. It does not seem to be an isolated incident. And I'm just excited to have our fabulous duo to come and talk with us and walk with us through this. What say you? What say you?
I am right there with you. I think we are in an extremely interesting time, and more than that, I think we're in a critical time. It's a point where people are starting to see some of the same cycles, come back around when it comes to the types of discussions that we're having. But there is something very different about it this time. I think we often get used to, and I remember having these conversations back in 2020 when attention first started to be paid again to topics like DEI and DEIJ and all of the acronyms, and just the caution that was put out at that point of this conversation only goes too far or so far before people get too uncomfortable and start trying to dismantle it in whatever ways they can. And I think that's back to where we are now, but it is more than just dismantling an idea. It's also getting back into some of that critical work of tearing down people and uh, that sort of dismantling and deadening of sometimes literally of some of these leaders. And yeah, I think we're going to dive into a lot of that tonight in very powerful ways, and I am looking forward to it.
So am I. So without further ado, let's get right into introducing our two frequent presenters. I call them the fabulous duo who bring the hot topics and really give us something to think about and to deeply consider. And so I am really looking forward to this evening. With that being said, I will see you on the other end.
All right. Well, as always, welcome to our audience, whoever is joining us this evening, whether you're here in Flagstaff, anywhere throughout the state of Arizona, anywhere throughout these United States, or in the world. We know that these conversations touch on our unique stories here, but also on the broader Live Black experience across the nation. Tonight, we are going to be discussing the story of Harvard University's first Black and now former president, Dr. Claudine Gay. The conversation is going to take us through some of Harvard's history, including touching on its ties to the institution of slavery and its ties to Louis Agassiz, the attack by billionaire hedge fund CEO and Harvard donor Bill Ackman, the hyper-scrutiny and ultimate resignation of Dr. Claudine Gay, and the overall impacts of money, politics, and supremacist ideologies on the future of higher education. It is my honor and privilege to reintroduce you to two of our frequent collaborators, Dr. Treya Allen and Dr. Mary Roaf. Dr. Allen is the program manager for diverse and inclusive advising practice at the University of Arizona and a faculty member at Pima Community College. And Dr. Roaf is assistant professor of ethnic studies at Stanislaus State University, a K-12 teacher coach, and a public policy advocate in the nonprofit sector. And again, they are two of our favorite collaborators who always bring such rich and detailed discussions for us. I'm excited to see where they will take us tonight. So I will turn it over to our speakers.
Hello. Hi again, Sister Dr. Treya. I just want to say I think we definitely qualify for the Live Black Experience frequent flyer miles.
Indeed. Hi, friend. Let's get into it. I've been waiting all day for this, by the way. So let's go on and get into it.
It was a highlight of my day. I mean, I've been following this very closely, and I have a personal connection to Harvard, which I'll get into in a minute. So I really appreciate Coral Evans, Sister Bernadine Lewis, and Kara House, Councilwoman Kara House, for reaching out, and Sister Reverend, Bernadine Lewis, for inviting Dr. Treya and I to weigh in on this very timely issue, which, as the flyer articulates, Dr. Claudine Gay was Harvard's first Black and now former president. And I took this quote from a New York Times editorial op-ed that Dr. Gay wrote a day after her resignation as the first president of Harvard. And the op-ed is entitled, "What Happened at Harvard is Bigger Than Me." So to give a little bit of context to this statement, what happened to Dr. Gay is actually nothing new. I mean, we can even go back to Dr. Nicole Hannah-Jones, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and scholar and activist, who was responsible for coordinating and collating the first 1619 project, which was initially introduced to the world, the 1619 project, which was introduced to the world in the fall of 2019 or summer of 2019, and was ironically a special issue of the New York Times Magazine. And she was also blocked and ousted from her position as a faculty member at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, in a very similar fashion. And what I will say is that a similar kind of actions and campaigns are happening on my campus as I speak. I mean, the only Black dean on our campus who started in the fall of 2022 has been subjected to an extremely egregious and white supremacist attack to oust him. So this is nothing new. Next slide, please. So what we're seeing is a longstanding dynamic in the United States in particular of we've never really come fully out of a civil war in this country when it comes to race, when it comes to maintaining white supremacy by any means necessary. And it is in its death throes. Okay. And these folks are literally white knuckling, pun intended, this change, right, that is upon us. And so what happened with Dr. Gay is really what happens with so many, not only African-American women, but BIPOC people in a variety of institutions and positions, not only within the academe, but across the board. And she was the latest casualty who was caught in the crosshairs of this ongoing 21st century version of culture wars, which is really the ongoing civil war in this country. What we are doing this evening with you is we are sharing our insights, our analysis, and our conviction by dividing up what happened with Dr. Gay into setting the context, both historically and contemporarily, in terms of the political and economic / financial and social dynamics and dimensions of how this is all played out and the new tactics that are being weaponized. And I will share about the context, and then Dr. Treya Allen will share about the incident itself. Next slide, please. So in order to understand the political and social and cultural context of what's happening now, of the most motley and unholy of alliances between Jewish Americans and staunch white supremacists, who's one of the main pillars of white supremacy in the US is intensive anti-Semitism. So we have to backtrack to the civil rights movement pre and post to understand how did Jews become white folks in the United States, because they were not initially. And they were not in terms of the codification of whiteness itself. They also were not in terms of their accessing of opportunities, whether we're talking about higher education, employment, political office, etc. When I was completing my doctorate at Temple University in Philadelphia from 2000 to 2008, my committee members consisted of 2 Jewish women and an outside committee member. And this text was required reading for me in terms of looking at the critical racial formation and how it shifts and evolves over time. And what it says about race in America, and what we're seeing is the legacy of this key watershed moment when it comes to the racialization of Jewish Europeans, of Ashkenazi Jews, i.e. white, racialized as white. We know it's more complex than that. They're European, they're Ashkenazi, right? They're racialized as white. I would say that this is a seminal text, and I would say that this is a canonical text when it comes to understanding why we have Jewish Americans who are at the forefront of anti-Blackness at this time. So up until the 1960s, what I learned in this course and from this text that it still resonates with me to this day, because it was mind-blowing to me how many groups categorically benefited off the backs of Black social justice activism in this country. And I do want to kind of preface this with understanding that and recognizing that during the modern civil rights movement, because Black social justice activism is not new either, that's why scholars call it the modern civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s prior to the Black Power movement, is that Jewish Americans actually were our allies, and they were a part of the Black civil rights movement. And even prior to that, for example, with the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, someone who supported that was Dr. Franz Boas, who is considered the father of modern social, cultural, and the four-field approach to anthropology in the U.S., and who actually immigrated from Germany in the 19th century and had a prominent permanent scar, I believe it was on his face. When he came to the U.S., he lied and said that he had incurred this injury from an attack from an animal, but it had actually been in a duel that he had participated in because of anti-Semitism in his home country. And so up until the 1960s, Jewish American men in particular, we know women across the board were not able to access higher education in large numbers, even the most privileged white women. But in particular, Jewish American men had very restricted access to college right, to attaining a bachelor's degree, and even more limited access to pursuing postgraduate degrees such as JD law degrees, MBAs, medical degrees. They were largely prevented from being admitted to institutions, higher education institutions, and specifically the Ivy League elitist institutions up until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972. So Jewish Americans do not really gain access to whiteness and all of the access that comes with that, ironically, until after the modern civil rights movement that was led by a majority African-American civil rights activists. Next slide, please. 60 years later, Jewish Americans, not all, but I would say that and recognizing that we know when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, the increase in anti-Semitism, hate crimes, and bombing of synagogues increased exponentially, right? It's nuanced. Having said that, from a macro structural level, the shift in the access of Jewish Americans and the expansion of the category of whiteness itself post-civil rights in the US means that 60 years later, some Jewish Americans are no longer white. They are white supremacists. This is a photo of Bill Ackman, a hedge fund manager, billionaire on Wall Street, and his wife, Louis Agassiz. And he is one of a number of prominent Jewish Americans. I would say the latest one that I saw was Mark Zuckerberg, who's promoting one of his cronies to be Jewish cronies to become a member of what was called the Board of Overseers or whatever. They changed the name at Harvard in 2020, right? A la the renewed or espoused purported commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So he is one of a number of very prominent, very wealthy Jewish Americans who have joined forces with very anti-Semitic white supremacists to perpetrate anti-Blackness and misogynoir, which is anti-Blackness directed against Black women specifically. And we'll get into the genealogy of the evolution of current day white supremacy and these campaigns. I do want to say that the person who also got caught in the crossfire of these actually greatly embellished, exaggerated, and actually inaccurate allegations of Dr. Gay committing plagiarism in some of her research is Louis Agassiz, Bill Ackman's wife, who actually committed plagiarism and who was a prominent scholar at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And she was actually copying and pasting passages from Wikipedia on her dissertation. This Business Insider, a number of publications are outing this. And so now there's this back and forth between Bill Ackman and other people, journalists in particular, who were doing their job and basically pointing out and highlighting the hypocrisy, the double standards, the fact that this is a pretense to push out the first and former Black president of Harvard. And that when this publication printed the news and the receipts of Louis Agaziz's actually quite alarming plagiarism, because Wikipedia is not a valid academic source. I don't allow my students to cite Wikipedia in their research, whether it's a presentation or a paper. She already had stopped. She's no longer teaching at MIT. So it's the optics of it. It's a great question. And what is happening is Dr. Ackman, it then went on the defensive and accused the publication, Business Insider, of attacking his family. based on the same allegations that he weaponized against Dr. Claudine Gay. We never said there's no congruency with white supremacy in the rhetoric. It's very easy to debunk it, but the problem is he comes with the purse strings. So when you have massive amounts of money, what was it, a decline of $100 million in planned donations to Harvard, right? It's the money talks. So she's his wife, and she's in her soft girl era. So she's not even a scholar at MIT anymore. Next slide, please. So in terms of the current day context, I'm still honing in on how the current attacks on Ivy League institutions, on singling out presidents of these institutions who are Black and or who are women. Because the first, after those congressional hearings on Capitol Hill about why the elitist institutions in the country are allowing anti-Semitism, even though what's actually happening is students who are critical of Israel, which is not the same as being anti-Semitic. Israel does not automatically equate with all Jews categorically, with all people of Jewish descent, unless you say Ashkenazi / white Jewish descent, European Jewish descent. So they're conflating that. So we got to talk about it. We're watching genocide in real time play out in front of our faces. There are escalating conflicts in the Middle East that have spread from Gaza and Israel. And this is not a war. What's happening in Israel and Gaza is not a war. It's out and out genocide, because a war connotes that you've got at least somewhat equal opponents in terms of having access to weapons, to a military force. So this is not a war. And I understand the Hamas attacks and what happened, and I'm not condoning that or minimizing that. And what I'm saying is that has a long history. I'm not going to get into that particular history because the talk is not about Israel that was established in 1948 as a pro-Western apartheid state in an oil-rich region of the world at the same time that apartheid was established in South Africa in 1948. I studied Israel in undergrad many years ago in the Georgetown School of Foreign Service and International Relations. It's common knowledge about the genealogy of Israel. So there are all kinds of protests, many different voices, including members of the current administration's own staff in the White House and even in the diplomatic corps against the U.S. continuing to support this genocide, and also spreading the conflict to Yemen, to Iran, and to Syria, I believe. So, I mean, we're heading towards World War III. So, as of January 26, 2024, the death toll in Gaza is more than 26,000. And what I will say unapologetically is that the way that white supremacists who wrote the book on anti-Semitism are weaponizing and exploiting a truly, truly, truly dire time beyond tragic period when it comes to this long-standing neo-colonial state of Israel. Anyone who critiques what's happening, I'm talking about valid critiques, but anyone who critiques what's happening in Gaza is being labeled as a white supremacist. And Chris Roaf is online. You'll find him as a conservative kind of political pundit. He's a white supremacist. We're going to use the language. We're going to call a thing what it actually is. And his agenda is to maintain white supremacy by ejecting BIPOC and Black women in particular and any opponents to white supremacy, not only in K through 12, but higher ed. And he's trying to dismantle all of the DEI initiatives that were most recently instituted at a larger scale than we had ever seen historically in 2020. And they are succeeding when it comes to especially corporate-backed DEI initiatives across the country. That's his agenda. And Jewish Americans who became white, ironically, Bill Ackman went to Harvard. He attended Harvard, and the reason why he was able to attend Harvard was because of the modern civil rights movement, period. And yet still wants to address DEI in terms of anti-Semitism, but then wants to strip away every other kind of form of DEI. So it's incredibly, the cognitive dissonance is huge, and it doesn't matter. They're barreling forward with this. So neoconservative white supremacists such as Chris Rufo have now been joined by Jewish Americans who became white, and some of whom are now white supremacists in the context of what's happening here, to completely dismantle DEI in higher education right now. It's going to go beyond that. It's already been going beyond that. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk about, we see this historically in the United States constantly. We see whenever there are any kind of gains made, there's always a white lash, and there's always an attack on any kind of policies, laws, norms, practices. We saw this at the conclusion of the Civil War, when even prior to its ending, you had Southern states clamoring in their legislative bodies to pass the Black codes. And after a mere about 7 years of Reconstruction from 1870 to 1877, you then have the imposition of Jim Crow segregation, which is probably eclipsed only by apartheid in South Africa and now in Gaza and Palestine, okay, for nearly 100 years. And then you have the civil rights movement, and you have key votes like the Voting Rights Act, which has now been completely gutted, as well as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There was actually a Civil Rights Act of 1865, or I believe of 1865 was the first one. Anyway, you know, and so we see the backlash against Reconstruction to rebuild the Deep South, to create a pathway not only to citizenship, but to actual viable opportunities of formerly enslaved, approximately 4 million formerly enslaved African Americans. Then you get about 100 years of Jim Crow segregation. You have the election of Barack Obama, a two-term president. There's an immediate white lash. And what I mean by white lash is a hostile or violent reaction by white people and by white supremacy itself as a system and as a structure to the advances or influx of other racial or ethnic groups. And I would say other gendered groups, other groups in terms of sexual orientations, et cetera. And especially, let's talk about socioeconomic status. I mean, they're all rewinding the clock to feudal Europe, where they're trying to create a quasi-feudal 1% of the wealthy, and everyone else are peasants and serfs. So the latest tug of war in the US when it comes to this constant back and forth and reaction and reactivity to any kind of meaningful social change, really, and especially when we talk about the surgence of DEI and the retreating from DEI, which is happening now in many instances, is in 2020, the global explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was an ongoing iteration of Black social justice activism. And this particular organization was created in 2013 in response to the acquittal of teenager Trayvon Martin's death and murder by George Zimmerman. So we know that the George Floyd incident was basically the knee on the neck heard around the world when a video was disseminated across social media and flooded all of the channels across the World Wide Web in 2020 of George Floyd experiencing excruciating death by asphyxiation by having the knee on his neck of a police officer. I will not name him. I will not give him that respect. It was so brutal and so and delivered so coldly and so bloodlessly, very similar to the genocidal systemic actually killing machine of the Nazis during the Holocaust, which is ironic because what Israel is doing right now is not systematic and it's very violent and brutal. But because this incident, there have been many deaths, right? There have been many killings of unarmed Black girls, boys, men, and women in the U.S. leading up to George Floyd's death. It was so dramatic. And so this is what sparked that light, that fuse that really exploded Black Lives Matter on a global scale. So then you have all of these corporations and companies that are rushing to create diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in 2020. But based on the research that I've done, by 2023, many of these companies are already backtracking. And I have the link to the article in my actual notes. But one of the reasons for this cited, and one of the reasons articulated by someone in corporate America, said the DEI didn't add any business value. So then we get to 2020 to 2024. As I stated before, this is very coordinated. It is very well organized. All social movements are not social justice movements. This is absolutely a white supremacist, fascist social movement. And there are many arms to it, like there are many arms to, right, Black social justice movements. So we start out with raising the alarm after the publication of that New York Times special issue magazine in 2019 titled The 1619 Project. There's this total misuse intentionally and spread of mass disinformation about critical race theory, about and against critical race theory. And this is a campaign that's largely waged in K through 12 schooling. Then we go on to where it is being targeted in colleges and universities, as we can see from the complete overhaul of what Governor DeSantis has been doing in Florida with some of the universities there. And now in the current day, we're looking at this move to dismantle all of the DEI initiatives, but at all affirmative action and any kind of equity whatsoever to slam the door shut once again on all BIPOC people from accessing opportunities across the board. Right now, it's concentrated at Ivy League elite universities. It is, and as we can see, the backtrack has already been happening in corporate America, and it's going to continue to spread. It will not be isolated to the highest ranking levels of African Americans or other people of color. And what's especially been effective about this current strategy to dismantle all of everything that falls under the umbrella of DEI is the weaponization of anti-Semitism, specifically in relation to the genocide that is happening in Gaza, and weaponizing it to perpetrate white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and Islamophobia. And it will not be limited to these groups. As we can see from the resignation of the white woman president of University of Pennsylvania prior to Claudine Gay's resignation, the attack is also based on gender. If we don't understand that this is intersectional, that they're coming for everybody, and they really do want white women in particular to repopulate the race and go back in the kitchen. That's been happening too. I've said it before. White women are in an interesting position where they're going to have to choose between white privilege or gender equity, but they can't have both. Here's what I want to say. The arguments and the rhetoric being used are also nothing new. It's called social eugenics. the articles that I read and the critical commentators that I watched, one of whom is a Harvard graduate who actually took a course with Dr. Gay, they're just they're using all of, not even so coded dog whistle language, is that she's innately, inherently unqualified, unintellectual, lacking of academic rigor in her research because she is Black and she is a woman. The rhetoric and talking points around dismantling DEI and this campaign has made its way all across the country, including in my system, the CSU in California, is that DEI, and I had a student in a doctoral program from the UC system in Merced, who is a young white man whose ops for us talk about the white faculty, primarily white male faculty, not all, but some, who invited him into this space, and when he questioned them, they gaslit him. And they trying to bribe him, right, with white privilege, and he's not going for it. But so this is an insider, okay, account. And the language that they're using is basically saying DEI is intrinsically anti-intellectual, anti-merit. It lowers the standards. It allows all of these unqualified others. That is social eugenicist language. That is a false dichotomy. DEI is not mutually exclusive with excellence, with academic rigor. It's not. It's not. And this has been happening for a long time. My sister graduated from Harvard in 1986. She attended Harvard in 1982, not because of affirmative action, but because she was a superstar. And ironically, affirmative action is not simply based on race or even gender. It's based on geographic location and the number of students who are enrolling from different geographic regions and states in the United States. There's a lot that goes into it, but only the part about race got attacked. And so my sister was the only high school graduate from the state of Arkansas to attend Harvard in 1982. So there's more about geographic location and representation. And she had a Latinx friend, and consistently on the campus, they were stopped. Like, he was stopped by security. He would be riding around campus on his bike going to class, and the security would always stop this young Latinx man and always ask him for ID. Why are you here? You don't belong here. Do you have access to his high school transcripts? Do you have access to his extracurricular activity records? Do you have access to his SAT and ACT scores? That's social eugenics. You're going to assume that a Latinx man automatically doesn't belong at Harvard because of how he's racialized. The same with my sister. People would kind of sidle up to her and like, oh, what were your SAT scores? Blah, 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 blew them out of the water. The tops of their heads exploded when she told them. Oh, what are your qualifications? She was constantly being questioned of why she was there as a Black woman, because she did not belong there to them. It doesn't matter. We can check off all the boxes. We can run circles around our non-Black counterparts. So it's like, it's a two-sided argument that they weaponize. It's like, well, you're not qualified without taking into account any of the historic and current reasons why people of color and Black people in particular don't have access to the same resources. But then when we are qualified, you're still not, because it's affirmative action, or it's a quota, or it doesn't matter what we do. The qualifications and the credentials are not recognized, and they're not respected. So this is just the latest iteration of this ongoing tug of war in this country. And Dr. Treya is going to get into the incident itself and what I do want to, and we're not just taking this sitting down. Part of it is raising awareness and education, calling out the hypocrisy, the double standards, and calling it what it is. And I do want to push, and this has always been happening too. This is going to, the agenda is for this to go far beyond the ivory tower. That's the agenda. That's the agenda. And the agenda is to go far beyond those who are designated as DEI or DEI adjacent in their formal job titles. It's going to go far beyond that. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Treya. I think that's it.
Thank you, sis. Next slide, please. So I want to, before we even start, and I think we were going to mention this, but we might as well just mention it now, is that a lot of times when we are talking about a conversation that deals with anti-Semitism, even if the word is mentioned, ultimately what happens is that word is also then used to shut down robust conversation, right? But we want to pause for a minute here and say that even though we're talking about Dr. Claudine Gay and all the other women across this country, Black women across this country who have had similar experiences, right? The thing that we miss the most is when we're talking about this incident, we miss that we had political figures and billionaires co-opt the atrocities that happen when we hyper target or hyper visualize a group of people, in this place, Jewish folks or folks who are Muslim. They co-opt that for a larger strategy. And really what's being communicated here is they don't care about none of y'all at all. Because here's the thing, white supremacy ain't out here just hurting Black people. It hurts other people too, whether we acknowledge that or not. So before I even get into the incident, what I do want to get into really quickly, next slide, please, is this quote by Dr. Carol Anderson. And Dr. Carol Anderson writes a lot of books, and forgive the typo, but her name is Carol Anderson. So I want to make sure she is a historian. She writes a lot of books around the vote and disenfranchisement of communities. But ultimately in this book, White Rage, she talks about that the trigger for white rage, so this violent uprising, whether that is physical violence or the attack of one's character, social eugenics, if you will. But the trigger for white rage inevitably is Black advancement. It is not the mere presence of Black people that is the problem. Rather, it is Blackness with ambition, with drive, with purpose, with aspirations, and with demands of a full and equal citizenship. It is Blackness that refuses to accept subjugation, to give up. A formidable array of policy assaults and legal contortions have consistently punished Black resilience and Black resolve, right? So what we're seeing here is not necessarily she didn't give a great response on what they would do if someone was calling for the genocide of people. Instead, what we're seeing is a larger game of how do we get rid of anything that removes, watch this, y'all, the status quo and those who have been in power, right? Because ultimately, when we talk about higher ed, the original purpose of higher ed was to keep systems in play. So this liberal education that we're talking about here was actually a creation of the aristocracy, that we want to maintain power and control. So if you belong to the marketing class, we want to make sure our kids can uphold that and reap the benefits of that same class. And so to have not just one president, next slide please, but 3 presidents of these Ivy League institutions that then come in and are representative of this shift, even if 2 of them appear to be white women, it disrupts that status quo. So on December 5th, we have this congressional hearing, and they literally call this hearing, y'all, Holding Campus Leaders Accountable and Confronting Anti-Semitism hearing. That is the name of the hearing. They asked the presidents at this meeting, it was like, well, you had some uprisings on campus around this uptick in violence in Islamophobia and anti-Semitism after the October 7th attacks by Hamas. Now, listen, this is not my area of expertise, so I'm going to say the targeted attack of any human being by another group of human beings, like, we need to consider that, y'all. Like, seriously, I don't care what your name is. Wrong is wrong. Right. So we're going to put that to the side. And I also want to put it to the side because I don't want to simplify what that action means or what it doesn't mean. But then they go forth and they call these presidents to the campus, and they also call a professor of American and Jewish studies. I think her last name is Nadell. And they say to these presidents, well, tell us what your definition is. And all of these presidents give very poignant and very cleared legal definitions of what harassment is, what freedom of speech is, and the issue with maintaining the balance on college campuses. Every president deals with that. At what point does it become harassment? At what point is it freedom of speech? And at what point can we intervene and not infringe upon the rights of students? There's also some ethical issues in there. So that happens. What immediately happens after that is McGill, the president from UPenn, 4 days later, basically resigns because donors start pulling out because they're not happy about her stance and what she said. By the way, y'all, McGill is a whole lawyer out in these streets, a whole entire lawyer. And all of these presidents were prepped by their what would be an office of general counsel. The answers that they gave to these questions were legally correct. But this becomes a trial of morality. At one point, Dr. Gay, in this hearing, I think it was the representative from New York, was like, your morality is deplorable. I think I'm paraphrasing. But the problem with that is they're being called to, one, answer for things that are happening on their campus. And all of these women have only been in their roles for 1 year. Now, if we could just 1 year or less, if we could just step back here, 2020, 2021, and I was digging in research, I was looking in law books, everything. I said, has there ever been a congressional hearing on anti-Asian rhetoric or hate? Because, the uptick of that was happening in 2021. I said, has there ever been a congressional hearing that called to count college presidents, Ivy League college presidents, a lot of whom have shared histories of wielding institutions that use Black and brown bodies as either capital or forced labor to build their institution? I'm just going to let that sit out there. I said, has there ever been a congressional hearing for any of those atrocious acts that have happened in the last 4 years against Black or Asian communities? And this is not to pit one community against the other, but I do want to call out the ridiculousness of, we can't have this conversation without talking about the intersectionality of their gender. That also must take play here. Race, we must give an account for this here. If you're wondering, those things have never happened at all. We have had congressional hearings that debated the legitimacy of reparations, even though a New York official just figured out a way to give reparations to Holocaust survivors, right? I'm gonna just step back from that. Y'all go find that. That's recent, right? To the tune of like 183 million. We've never seen that before here. And so after this event, next slide, please. What ends up happening is we have this, I won't give you the privilege of seeing his face again, but Rufo, real Chris Rufo, then goes on Twitter. I don't care what Elon Musk calls it. It will always be Twitter to Black folks. But he goes on to Twitter to basically lay out his plan, not only against Claudine Rufo, but also DEI. So this one tweet, which I'm sorry for the pixelation, Rufo says, we launched the Claudine Gay plagiarism story from the right. The next step is to smuggle it into the media apparatus of the left, legitimizing the narrative to the center-left actors who have the power to topple her, then squeeze. Now, the entire time that we're talking about this, I can't remember I think his name was Randy Pouch. He did this famous last lecture, and he's like, y'all have to watch for the punt fake, right? We are thinking like, oh my gosh, they didn't respond well to questions about anti-Semitism. But really what we're looking at is a concerted attack on DEI and anything that leaves the status quo in place. So you got to be really mindful when you're thinking about this. Now, the crazy part about this is, and the good sis Brittany Packnett Cunningham lays this out, is that you have white supremacist extremists or white nationalists who will lay out their plan of attack, then go do the attack, and then come back and say, if you want to support my work, please donate here. All on social media accounts and public media that go unchecked at all. But if you point that out, what Brittany Packnett was saying about this is that in pointing this out, it makes the person pointing it out a target, because ultimately we do not want you to hear what's really going on. And I would just like to bring in the good prophet, the good prophet. Actually, I'm going to leave him out of it. But essentially, what I want to say is some of y'all have an allegiance to losers that is just unnatural. Period. Just some of y'all do. Because if we actually believe that this is really about someone plagiarizing, which, by the way, Harvard had no issue other than, hey, you need to tighten up these resources. Hey, you need to tighten up this citation, of which she did. If we really believe that this is about plagiarism, we are missing the real game that is going in front of us. Mark Lamont Hill said, when Black folks first got to this country, the first thing that they did is they were like, oh no, we got to make laws so that they can't read. And then our history tells us that only 5% of Black people were literate. That doesn't make sense. If only 5% of people were literate, then why do we have anti-literacy laws? And the same thing here. If this is really about plagiarism, then why wasn't this taken care of in different ways? And really, it's not about plagiarism. It is about using an apparatus that introduces a mechanism that allows us to then attack DEI and the status quo. Next slide, please. So I just want to show you the timeline of this so that you're like, well, I think you're stretching it. No. 12/5, we have the congressional hearing. 12/9, we have the first president that McGill who resigns, right? I believe it said something like, because it's starting to affect the institution. Now, what you should know is the other two presidents, Gay, which is one of them, and the MIT president, initially those colleges backed those presidents, right? So they walk away from this hearing with the support of both their boards and the faculty and other constituencies at their college. On 12/19, Chris Rufo tweets this out, letting people know this is what we're doing. Here's our next wave of attack. And then we see the resignation of Dr. Gay on January 2nd that was then accepted, because then now it's causing bad light to fall on Harvard. Now here's the really crazy thing here is during 2020, and I would say 2020 to 2022, we had this uptick in support Black women, defend Black women, protect Black women. And if this institution really wanted to support, defend, and protect Black women and send a message, right? Because what you do to the least of these or the most oppressed benefits all of these, then they would have stood by her. But institutional politics, right? And so I guess we're supposed to be happy that both McGill and Gay get to keep their tenured positions, as if that is a consolation prize. Yep, you have to step down from this position, but don't worry, you still get to keep your tenured position. But ultimately, when we're looking at this timeline and how this happens, next slide, please. What we're actually looking at are the stories that whiteness tells itself. And so this is a quote from David Mura, who talks about whiteness makes itself the victim of its own crimes and tells the tale to itself. This is an abuser psychology on the group level. The problem isn't that what white people have done to Black people, but that Black people keep remembering what white people have done, and that somehow harms white people and Black people. To which Black people reply, if we can remember and live with the past and what your ancestors have done to our ancestors, why is it you can't remember and live with the same past? Now, this notion of using stories or counter stories to like then shift the blame, shift the focus of actually what's going on is not a new phenomenon. Let me demonstrate. Next slide, please. So the stories that whiteness tells itself can start all the way from, and y'all, there are more stories out here, but these are just 4 prominent ones. So Thomas Jefferson in the Notes on the State of Virginia then uses a description of Black people about their inferior intellect and their need of, they don't need much sleep. They don't really experience emotions. Their griefs are transient. He uses this to then justify the atrocities and the pedophilia that's your homeboy, not mine, that was happening at the time to then protect a financial mechanism and to keep people in positions of power. Then if we skip on down to 1965 and we talk about the Moynihan Report, this homeboy was like, yo, Black folks have suffered through enslavement, they have suffered through Jim Crow, but ultimately what's wrong with them is there's no father in the home. That's why they're messed up. Not systemic racism, not systemic housing policies that exclude Black folks, and not just Black folks here, but that's who we're talking about tonight. Not the systemic and historical exclusionary acts around education and access to funding. Not even the creation of the middle class through the GI Bill, which Black folks were all but excluded from. But we don't talk about any of that. They're like, basically, they don't have no daddy in the home, and that's why they're messed up. Then if we go further on to the Southern strategy in the 70s or so, now a lot of people are like, Treya, this Southern strategy was about Republicans turning the South Republican. And it's a political strategy. Let me just be very clear. All of these are a political strategy, right? But in the Southern strategy, we had very specific language where we are using said language to then describe who we want and who we don't want in certain parties, and how we draw the lines to disenfranchise the number of people or the large bodies of Black people who are in the South so that we remain in power. We see evidence of this today. That Huckabee could be the governor of a state is mind-blowing to me. But this is all, even though the Southern strategy in large part did not succeed the way they wanted it to, in some cases it did, especially when we talk about language around who gets what and when. And then finally, you had things like in the 80s, and this is just one story. This one is about the welfare queen. And Josh Levine writes about this. And this was Reagan's doing, who paints out the Black woman as a welfare queen who is gaming the system. And from then until now, the biggest recipients of welfare in this country have always been poor whites and corporations. Listen, y'all, we don't argue facts here at all. It just is what it is. Now, this is very interesting when you think about the totality of Blackness, but let me tell you the stories we tell about Black women. Next slide, please. Ultimately, Black women are only palatable once they fit, especially in higher ed, if they fit the stereotypic trope of mammy. I have no care for self. It is not about me. It is about the institution. I just want to make sure these babies are safe. I want to advance your agenda. My family will be okay. There is somebody taking care of my family. I'm just worried about you, whatever the institution is, whatever the program is, whatever the department is. The absolute moment where Black women start to assert themselves and to see themselves as human, we label them as Sapphire, or in this case, Cori Bush. Cori Bush was just, her family was actually threatened and continues to be threatened. And there was a politician, a white male politician, who was like, well, if she wasn't so loud, maybe it wouldn't happen. If she would change the way that she talked, she wouldn't happen. This also happened with Serena Williams when we called her an angry Black woman, when she refused to accept the erroneous and corrupt calls of an official, and she was drawn as a petulant child throwing a fit. Now, if you're like, these things don't happen all the time, I think these are just very unique cases. What you should know about the sapphire trope, which we have characterized Cori Bush in, the constant nagger who is always nagging to get what she wants, or the angry Black woman, is that these are stereotypic caricatures of Black womanhood that are meant to silence and tone police so that they never defend or never speak up for themselves. And so as long as you are mammy, you are the institutional pet. But as soon as you exercise intelligence, or you speak out, or you go against whatever narrative is told about Black womanhood that is safe for consumption by the masses in a society, then you are immediately labeled something that is either nagging, hard to work with, aggressive, or just an angry Black woman. And this, I think, is what we are seeing here. The only issue here that we have not discussed is when we talk about the intersectional violence that is occurring, what we are not fully seeing is this action, today's actions in the grand scheme of things. And I will tell you this, next slide, please. One of the most powerful things that I've heard this week was when I was in a conversation or in a webinar with Dr. Carol Anderson. And she said, we are living in the white rage reaction to 2020. 2020 was the year where we had a racial reckoning. Black folks and any other oppressed community was like, we've been telling y'all this. And now we're just angry. You had corporations, institutions, the random person. I remember in 2020, I was helping a colleague at a different institution, and she said to me, can I cash app you for your labor? And everyone's like, oh, we want to get paid for you. That's a compliment. You want to get paid for your labor, but it wasn't payment for my labor. It was payment. It was a payment against her guilt, and not the guilt because she participated in systemic violence, or maybe you did if you just said nothing at all, but her guilt behind not actually about choosing not to be aware of what is going on. So if we think that this just happened to Claudine Gay, and I'm going to end here. I started by saying there are several Black women who have a Claudine Gay experience. They may not be presidents of institutions, but they have definitely had one. And while I do not have permission to share their names, I do have permission to share their stories. How about being the first Black dean of a college and you increasing not only the diversity of your faculty, but even restructuring an organization or department in the middle of a pandemic, and then waking up one morning in August 2023 to a slip that says, we are restructuring your department. Thank you for your service. You are dismissed. There's another story of a colleague who essentially was put into a position, begged to be in this position, an associate vice provost position, I think it was set up for the fall because the idea was that they never wanted change to be made at all. And as soon as she was successful, then she was attacked and told that she was too mean, that she was targeting folks. Her information was doxed and then had to basically go into hiding to make sure that she could protect her family. And when she found out that the institutional leadership was not going to support her in any way, she ended up having to make the forced decision of resignation. Now, we talk about, oh, well, they made the decision to resign, but we don't talk about the financial impact, the psychological impact, or the emotional labor and the toll of that, of having gone from being in a position where you know you can do the work to then being demoted. even if it's just in public eye. And so even though we're like, oh, we're post-race, is that what they used to say? It says like we're in a post-racial society. What we are seeing across the board is that everybody is having a Roxanne or a Claudine Gay moment where they're being questioned about their credibility, despite them having the credentials and having proven their ilk through service, deed, and scholarship. We are also seeing them being questioned very much like Phyllis Wheatley. And I wish I could remember the sister who says this, but she said every Black woman has a Phyllis Wheatley moment where we are made to stand in front of the populace and defend our intelligence. Y'all, this is not a one-time thing, but I will tell you, we must look bigger than just the Claudine Gay incident. We are living in the white rage reaction of 2020. I'm done, good sister.
That's got to be my first reaction to this conversation. I have been sitting back, and I am very glad Reverend Dr. Lewis did not have me on camera through your entire presentation, because you would have seen a lot of this, a lot of pearl clutching, a lot of everything. This was very important conversation. I want to take us back a little bit as we get back into the context of all of this, because I think there are very interesting things that happen when we look at the relationship between the resignation of Dr. Gay and Harvard's history with Louis Agassiz. It's very interesting to me that in looking up just some of the history of Harvard with Louis Agassiz, his information comes up primarily in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Harvard. And one of the first things that struck me as interesting was that they had a program for diversity and equity within that department. But when you click on the page for diversity and equity, you see that the name has shifted to diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So they've taken out the equity piece and are focusing there. But that aside, what is really interesting is how the page focuses on Louis Agassiz, and it falls under a section called Imagery, Signage, and History of Racism. And it dedicates a lot of time to noting his racist and white supremacy ideologies, his pseudoscientific work on race to attempt to formalize segregation, and Harvard's attempts, or what they call their attempts, to address that legacy. So I'm wondering if either or both of you can spend some time addressing some of that legacy, like what that connection was, what it means to the institutionalized nature of racism, segregation, and supremacist ideologies, and what it means that his legacy is still literally and figuratively ingrained in one of our nations and recognized as one of the world's leading academic institutions. Like, what does it mean that they are saying that they're reckoning with this history at the same time that his name still appears on buildings and in these systems?
Yeah, I'll start in with that. Thank you for that question. So I want to just, again, I'm the context. I love context. So one of the, I think, actually biggest kind of snow jobs is that higher education is a bastion of liberal or progressive thought. And so what I mean to say about that is, for example, I had a recent publication where I cite a critical article on higher ed as an institution in and of the United States, which is the longest running white supremacist nation state in modern day history with anti-Blackness at its core. And this article is literally titled, "The Academy is a Plantation." And Dr. Treya referred to some of that as like the labor of Black and brown bodies. I mean, we see this with a number of elite institutions such as Georgetown, which is my alma mater, a couple of years ago when they had their reckoning with selling off a number of enslaved people of African descent when Georgetown was at a pivotal time in its history and it was about to go under as an academic institution. So what's really important to understand, precisely because the Harvards, the Yales, the UPenns, the oldest elitist education institutions, as with all other institutions, literally are based on and emerge out of colonization, genocide, land conquest, stolen labor, enslavement. They are not progressive. They are not liberal bastions. Across the board, higher education perpetrates white supremacy in a myriad insidious in overt ways. And so it's not this legacy of Louis Agassiz and them not addressing it. It's not in spite of, it's precisely because of their elite status. Like what gets pedestalized, what gets elevated in this country and across the world. I mean, we're in an age of exposure. And so now we're starting to be able to counter these long-standing narratives. I remember I was listening to a really critical content creator who's renowned, who is a young millennial Black feminist voice and scholar in her own right. She's got a channel. She first kind of established her reputation as a serious, engaged scholar, also on social media on the channel called For Harriet. She's had a number of all kinds of speakers, including academics. And she's like, Harvard is not liberal. Most of the faculty and for sure the administration, not only they're probably more right of center or like more moderate than anything else. So I think we need to debunk this notion that higher education and these institutions who literally accrued their vast majority of their wealth and their status through scholars like Agassiz or pseudo scholars like Agassiz, and literally accrued their wealth from chattel slavery and colonization itself. So we have to completely debunk that entire narrative. And that applies to differing degrees to every higher education institution I've attended or where I've taught, including attending an historically Black college. We have to understand the very conservative and respectability politics around HBCUs. And I loved attending Florida A&M, and I really value HBCUs. And I also recognize that higher education is just an extension of white supremacy in the US, as all other institutions are also an extension of white supremacy. That's why the historic political and economic and social contexts are so important, because these institutions literally are in it and also of it. They emerge out of it and they continue to maintain their legitimacy through the status quo. And that's in part, I think, what was really, really savvy on the part of a Chris Rufo is in particular targeting the institutions who are the most kind of vaulted, like, because they're not, because as soon as they're starting to make some changes by, for example, having a Black woman president, while also conversely not addressing or redressing the legacy of a social eugenicist in the tradition of a Carl Linnaeus or a Charles Murray who wrote The Bell Curve, right? They're doing it for the optics. What's really chilling to me is they want to, we're also at a period of such intensive, as Dr. Treya said, we're going from white supremacy to white nationalism, because as actually conservative as these institutions are, they're not fascist enough. They're not authoritarian enough. These folks want to rewind the clock literally back to 1619. That's what they want to do.
Dr. Treya, any more on that?
You know, what I want to say is, until we take a very hard look in this country, not just hiding or cleaning up the language, which Harvard, like in the same article on there, they're like, we're working to like really clean up the language so that we can restore him to actually where he is. I cannot remember the scholar's name, but he is a theologian. And he says, some of y'all do not hate white supremacy enough for me because it benefits you. And so until we actually have a reckoning of what actually happened, we will continue every year to swing back and forth on this pendulum, right? To being like, oh, we're so sorry that this happened, and look at what our institution did. But right now, I'm like, I don't want you to hide that he was a part of your institution and was significant. I want you to recognize and kind of make atonement for that. Like, we recognize where we come from. And because of this is why we are working to dismantle these systems, known and unknown, seen and unseen, like really dismantling the hidden curriculum that we are upholding in our classrooms, in our policies. Because you cleaning up language does nothing for my ancestors who helped build the halls and the ones who are buried, whether it be by bone and body or by blood and sweat under the foundations of your institutions, while all the while participating in reports that say that the reason why we don't have enough Black students or we don't have enough brown students is because they're not academically fit. So like, come on, y'all, let's call a spade a spade. If we got buildings named after racist people, but then you try and hide that through cleaning up the language, by changing building names, all the things, that's not really us confronting our history. And we're just doomed to repeat it. So I would just prefer you call a spade a spade. He was a racist. Like, there's a line in here that says, oh, he thought himself to be an abolitionist. Most white people did. But really what they were saying is, I want them to be free, just not free here. I want them to have their freedom, but I don't want them to live with me. Y'all, even Abraham Lincoln, who everyone is like, that's the dude. He was like, yes, I freed them, but if I could have done it without it and brought the Union back together, I would have. But then he goes on to say something that is really key. I'm going to paraphrase this line. He was like, as it relates to the Black and white races, I don't want y'all to get it twisted. The Blacks are still inferior. They're just not bound to plantations anymore. And I would prefer it to be that way. So even when we talk about, oh, he thought himself to be an abolitionist, let's call a spade a spade. That is not abolitionist work. He was still a segregationist. He still believed in the inferiority of non-white people. And if we don't reconcile and recognize that, very much the way that some of these other countries have done, I think I want to say South Africa might be one of them where they have a reconciliation. If we don't do that as Americans, we will continue this cycle and we will see the uptick. Like, whoever thought that a president would be like, Proud Boys, stand by and stand up? Is that not a call for the same genocide that we are heralding certain other countries for saying the same thing? So that's all I'm going to say about that. Next question, Kara House.
Well, and what is, and I think Reverend Lewis might be on to talk more about this point, because one of the things that I find so ironic in this, and especially going back to what you just said, Dr. Allen, about truly reconciling that history or making work to reconcile that, is if we look at the timeline of what's happened with Harvard, I believe it was in 2022 that the ancestors of enslaved Africans that Agassiz commissioned to be photographed to prove Black inferiority have filed suit against the school to release those photos to their family. The Agassiz family has said, we want you to release these because that's the first step in a long road that we have to walk as a family to provide this restitution or restoration. And Harvard has systemically, first they ignored the requests, which is what led to the suit. And now they are just denying actually providing those photos. What really strikes me as ironic is that it was shortly after their final denial in court, when the suit was, I think, given to a lower court, and they were told add emotional damages to this and file against the school again. Shortly after that is when Dr. Gay was elected as president of the university. And one of the first things that was said in articles about her election was that maybe she would become responsible for providing restitution and restoration to the family of these formerly enslaved Africans that was being asked for. So the responsibility was placed squarely on her shoulders. She then, a couple months later, said that Harvard as an institution had the responsibility to provide that restoration and to actually do the work that they were being asked for. And then very shortly after that, there were the claims of plagiarism, and shortly thereafter, she was out as the shortest tenured president in Harvard's history. So there's a lot to kind of unpack in all of that and that timeline. But I want to invite Dr. Lewis, if you had thoughts on this whole process or that current situation, or questions or thoughts or whatever you wanted to bring to that part of the conversation.
I have a whole lot. One of those plantations that Agassiz visited to march 9 enslaved souls through the streets of Charleston, South Carolina, into a downtown photography studio. And those 9 souls were told to strip down and to be photographed. And 2 of those souls, imagine a father having to see his naked daughter, adult daughter. That plantation had over 300 enslaved souls. So imagine if Dr. Day had demanded that those families, one of them being Cleveland's, had been, imagine that alone, that one plantation that he visited, because he visited a few in Charleston, could have probably, that would have bankrupted Harvard. If you think about paying the descendants of those souls. I'm going to leave that there. My mother was a Cleveland, and 2 of those souls were my mother's, and I guess now my ancestors. So I'll leave that there because it's emotional, very demeaning, and embarrassing to see those photos. And I got to see those photos. I think I was 12. A researcher came to the South and actually exposed it. So that was how I found out about Agassiz. But I need us to do two things this evening. Nope, three. First of all, Dr. Treya, would you please define racism?
It is the inherent belief that one race is superior over another one, and it's a social construct, right? So there's no scientific information. It is just, I have decided that you, being this race, are inferior to another race, and treatment that results as a result of me believing that you are inferior. Prejudice, discrimination, all the things.
Okay, thank you for that. And Dr. Roaf, your pop quiz question. Define white supremacy.
Oh, I'll give the definition that I start out with my students. While it is an ideology, it frames the last 500 years of human existence across the globe, which is actually, according to Wallerstein, the first world system coming out of the interregional system of empires and civilizations and societies. It is the onset of intensive colonization in 1492 that brings us to the first world system, which is dominated by white supremacy. And at its simplest level, it literally is self-evident in the definition that it is everything and everyone deemed as white as being superior, as reigning supreme over everyone and everything else. And so it's not simply, so first of all, someone can say, like, we can be like, oh, I'm not racist, I'm not anti-Black. But if we have internalized the conditioning of whiteness itself and everything coming out of, let's say, Europe and the US, and right, simply positioning and pedestalizing whiteness itself as supreme over all else is white supremacy. So it's not merely anti.
And so what are we experiencing right now? What is this as we talk about Dr. Day? Is this white supremacy or is this racism?
It's both. I want to kind of get a little bit, maybe like methodical and a little bit mathematical. So white supremacy is the overall construct and justification that actually is created in a first world system kind of time period in the 18th and 19th centuries, when we really intensify European colonization of the rest of the world, which also entailed genocide and entailed land conquest. And, you have to have colonization before you have widespread enslavement. And so the white supremacy, or the supremacy of whiteness itself, out specifically of Europe, was used to justify and other specifically non-white peoples and those who are being targeted when it comes to colonization, which is indigenous, Native American, and then also those who are being targeted for enslavement, which is peoples of African descent and also indigenous and Native Americans. So white supremacy is used to justify this. And the mechanism of white supremacy is racist, right? Systemic racism. So in order to maintain the supremacy of whiteness and those classified as white, because that's what we're really talking about, those racialized as white, the mechanism is the oppression, right? The mechanism is the structural racism. Because if you're going to have a superior, you're going to have an inferior. If you're going to have a top, you're going to have a bottom, right? It's very binary. If you're going to have an up, you're going to have a down. And because of the way that colonization and genocide and conquest, land conquest and slavery played out, indigenous peoples and peoples of African descent are always at the bottom of the white supremacy hierarchy around the world, including in the US.
Thank you for that. Dr. Allen, what say you? Anything to add to that?
Yes, I think Dr. Roaf is like hitting on this, is that when we say white supremacy, a lot of times I think people just think this random white person. That's not what we're saying. If white supremacy is the ocean, then the sharks that are coming to get us, like in this situation, are sexism, it is racism, right? So white supremacy is the ocean. And so we have to broaden the way that we think about it, because we're like, that's morally wrong. Well, morality and legality are two different things. So they're like, oh, she didn't get fired. She stepped down. Legally, we've done nothing wrong. But where are you morally? And does that decision or our inability or folks' inability to be like, no, this is wrong, does that hinge more on because you benefit from the system and you don't want to speak out because you don't want to be the next person? But I also think, as I'll go back to what I said, I have never seen male presidents of any institution be called to the congressional hearing to discuss any matter at all that has anything to do with I believe it was responses of these institutions, two of which I believe are private. Is MIT private? I believe MIT is private, but if I'm wrong, I will admit it. I've never seen that happen. And that is also something that we have to take in account. McGill, like, this is tragic, right? For all of these women. McGill was like, I resign, I'm gonna go back and teach law school. But the hyper visibility and the hyper invisibility of Black women in higher ed makes this that much more, like, we can't just say, oh, it's racism. There's a lot of like matrices of oppression going on here. So it's not just because she's the first Black president, but she not only is she like the first Black female president of Harvard, she is the first Black president of Harvard. Not only is she like just this world-renowned political scientist, but she is also a political scientist who is a Black woman who graduated from Harvard. And so I think we can't skip over. We can't just like pigeonhole it into one thing. It's several things that are laying on top of it in a sea or in a system that is like, this is who we believe is superior versus inferior. Because you do have some people who are out there saying like, well, if she hadn't said this, then this wouldn't be happening. And I'm like, no, you're missing the point. We have never, ever done this with any other president ever. I can't recall. I've looked, I can't find it. And if I'm wrong, somebody like email us.
No, thank you for that. And Sister Kara, thank you of allowing me just a few moments. You know, we always say that we do this to educate, enlighten, and inform. And I feel like this evening's topic was the perfect time to really define the difference and explain and illustrate the difference between racism and white supremacy. I just have one last question before I turn it back over to my baby queen. Did Dr. Day really plagiarize? Is there any founded?
No,
She did not.
And that's what I need for us to put on
What
the
she
book.
did does not raise to the level of plagiarism
at all.
at all.
And can we just set the record straight here? Because there are so many false equivalencies,
Yeah.
right? So, oh boy's wife, Oxnam, I think is her last name.
She really did plagiarize.
I really need to. Okay, and so the other thing I want to say is this: even though we don't let our students use Wikipedia or cite Wikipedia, I dare not like disregard those scholars on there who are putting out profound information for the public masses, right?
Right.
But what we are talking about is somebody was like, I want to write a paper on butterflies. And they go to Wikipedia and they literally cut and paste.
And did not credit it at all.
No credit, nothing. No MLA, no APA, no ASA, none of that. So when we plagiarize, this is what plagiarism means, is that we do not we fail to give credit for someone else's scholarship, and we treat it as our own, and we put it in a paper. Anybody who has done a doctorate degree and you've had to write a dissertation or a thesis, those are the most trying moments of your life. And it is meant as an exercise to see if you can produce scholarship and then report back on that scholarship. What we are talking about is Oxnam took somebody else's research and was like, this sounds good and I'm tired. Let me just go on and put this in there. We are not talking about casual, I forgot to close the citations, I forgot to cite who it was, or I was reading an article, there was another article, and instead of going to get that article, I did an in-text citation. We're not talking about any of that. So the false equivalencies of weak citations being cited, and the Harvard, I think it's like the Constitutional Board, whatever they call themselves, they're not the Overseer Board anymore. They actually said, hey, we reviewed these 3 papers that have been brought to our attention. Please strengthen the citation.
Clean them up.
She then goes back and she strengthens the citation. Rufa was like, well, we got 8 other ones here. Now, you know what is so interesting about this citation thing is, y'all remember when Michelle Obama gave that bomb speech? We get Trump. His wife,
Melania, stole it. No credit.
This?
That's plagiarism.
And word for word. And it was a Black journalist, I believe, or okay, so let's call him a Black journalist, even if it's a public journalist, who was like, I've heard this before. There was this thing that happened that we watched happen with Oxnam as well, where Levia J.A. Jones talks about weaponized femininity. We will rush to the defense of mediocre white women who have done harm, y'all. And I'm not talking about all our sisters who happen to be white. I am talking, the people who I'm talking about know who I'm talking about. We rush to the defense of Melania Trump, a first lady with elegance and poise. And I watched us do the same thing with Oxnam. Like, her billionaire husband was literally hunting down the journalist who was like, yo, your wife plagiarized. And one of those articles, he was like, we've already dealt with this. Why are you bringing up old stuff?
It's the gaslighting. It's what they're just doing the same thing that you're doing and exposing the true agenda.
When we expose the mediocrity of her scholarship,
subpar, they don't even rise to the level of mediocre. And I'm going to start saying white mediocrity, and I'm going to call it what it is: subparness.
Yes, but when we expose it, what that does is it offers a counter story to the narratives we talk about when we talk about Black women not being capable, qualified, or able. And Oxnam was also at MIT. So I'm not saying tit for tat or anything else. What I want to expose here is when we talk about white supremacy and who gets to be considered superior and who gets a level of forgiveness, even when we know it was wrong. Because if Roxane Gay, why do I keep calling Roxane Gay? I love you, Roxane Gay. But if Dr. Claudine Gay actually pulled things from Wikipedia and put them in her dissertation, she would have been discredited and would not be able to work anywhere, because she would not be considered worthy of her ilk or her degrees. And that is the rub for us, right? Is that white supremacy says, oh, but Dr. Oxnam made a mistake. What?
And she's also from Haifa, Israel.
So now
she is from the Zionist, apartheid, Jewish white supremacy state of Israel.
So what we call, like, I think the other thing that happens is this: when Black women call this out, when we make a point to say, actually, let me step back. I don't want to talk about what we do when we call it out. When you are working on anything, any kind of certification, there is always a voice in your head that makes you go above and beyond, because you have to check and recheck that what you are doing is not going to be called into question. How many times have I called one of y'all and said, can you listen to this presentation? I have done the research. This is my area of expertise, right? But I understand that when I walk into the room, I don't care what people think about me. The only people I care about in the room are my community, because they are the ones that I'm representing in that room because of our hyper invisibility or visibility. How many times have we been like, oh, we have to make sure that this is on par? And then when it's received, people are, oh my gosh, this is great. But what if, no, ma'am, no, sir. And so this is the same thing. Like, we are not afforded weaponized femininity at all. No one is coming to our rescue.
No.
If Claudine Gay had plagiarized for real, we would be saying the same things. Well, she should have checked those references.
She never would have earned her PhD if she had
Never.
plagiarized. I'm going to tell you what would have happened.
Thank you.
From Dr. Treya and I and everybody who has run this gauntlet, she never would have earned the PhD.
Ever.
She would not be a Harvard alumna, and much less president, much less a faculty member, period.
Amen to that. And I don't know if that's Black morality. That's our level of ethics. That's because oftentimes I feel, and now hearing so many stories like this, I'm beginning to really contemplate heavily on, I think there is we are the nation's and maybe even the universe's measure for ethics and morality. We are constantly thinking about what is right and wrong. And many of us are oftentimes on the right side of wrong, because we know innately we don't get to do what they get to do. And so that is what I know in my personal work. That's what keeps me on the straight and narrow. And that is what causes me to do what Dr. Treya just talked about, the check and recheck and check again and check again. So I thank you all for helping us to set the record straight on this. I'm sorry, Ms. Kara, go ahead. Thank you for allowing me that grace and mercy. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. And all of that just really made me think of, there was an argument from two people. I think one of them might have been Cat Williams, and I forget who the other one was, but they were talking about the nature of white supremacy and how it's really rooted in white supremacy's knowledge of who we are as a people, but reflecting that in trying to disqualify and misdefine us, so that we're stuck looking at the misdefinition over here when the truth is over here, and it's the thing that they're trying to keep away from us. So the examples that one of the other speakers on that gave were, they called us lazy, and yet they made us slaves. So they relied on our labor. They claimed we were ignorant and incapable, and yet denied us the right to read or write. They claimed we were too inferior to contribute in the political sphere, and yet denied us the right to vote. And so, Dr. Allen, that really takes me back to the quote that you shared on the problem of Black ambition, Black drive, Black purpose, Black aspiration as triggers for white rage in response to the threat that they represent to white supremacy and white supremacist ideologies. So I think tonight was the first that I was really hearing such really pointed conversation about people like Christopher Rufo, I think. And just as you were sharing about him in the presentation, I was going and looking up some of his tweets and comments and what he said about the really insidious efforts of him and others who work with him to dismantle critical race theory, in saying we are going to poison this term so that people always associate it with negative things. The same thing with Dr. Gay, and saying we're going to, we came with this claim from the right. Our goal is to have the same claim seep into the left and just take her down. And so the fact that those sorts of systemic attempts to bolster white supremacist ideologies can get kind of pushed up that way, but not seen because we're distracted by the mischaracterizations and misdefinitions of whether it's Black genius or Black leadership or Black ambitions. It all just gets kind of masked behind these other things. So I know that wasn't really a question, but
I want to respond to that, Sister Kara. I think this is so critical. And the flip side of calling out the inconsistencies and the fallacious reasoning of we're lazy, but you enslaved us, and what Dr. Treya was sharing about any kind of Black excellence or aspiration or achievement is, and I believe it may have been Toni Morrison who stated this, and I could be incorrect about that, and this, again, this is specifically to referring to those who are racialized white, obviously who benefit from white privilege across the board, with or without gifts and actual hard work and actually going beyond. I think those are the individuals racialized white who are probably positioned to critique white supremacy and white privilege itself. And then their heads end up on the chopping block. If we look at President McGill and the current president, is the problem with white supremacy is deep down inside, they know all they have is their whiteness. When you talk about, that's why if you can literally hear this deeply embedded knowing in the white supremacist, white nationalist, and especially anti-Black talking voice, because it's literally a projection. White people created everything. We did everything. We're the scientists. We're the engineers. We built civilization. You didn't do any of that. You colonized, i.e. stole, and you continue to do that. So deep down inside, you cannot take away our minds. You cannot take away our knowledge. You cannot take away our skills. You cannot take away our genius and our brilliance and the enacting and materializing of that for generation after generation after generation. They actually suffer from the ultimate imposter syndrome because people like Chris Rufo, all he has is whiteness. And he knows that they literally just have not had to do what Black people, what BIPOC people have had to do. And they know if they don't keep their figurative feet on the necks of everybody else, and increasingly white women, right, who are achieving, they will be absolutely left in the dust. And they know that. All they have is whiteness. They don't have anything else.
I thought you was going to lead with a quote that was like, the very nature of racism is distraction. by our good ancestor, Toni Morrison. She was like, they say you have no history, so you go dig that up. They say you have no language, so you go dig that up. Listen, y'all, punt fake. Beware of punt fake. While we're over here, I was going to call Cat Williams a prophet earlier, but I'm going to call him that now. Cat Williams, and it was Mark Lamont Hill, who was like, look, y'all, more than focusing on what's going on out here, be so aware of who you are that we like chuck the BS out the window and we focus on the main thing. And for me, I'm gonna tell y'all, the main thing when I step onto a campus is, how are the children? Because the way the children are is the way our society will be. And so let me just give you the Nguni Bantu word for that. It's Kaseria Ingera, right? It means, and how are the children? It's a Maasai warrior greeting, because they understand that the nature of what's going on with the kids is the total depiction of what's going on in the society. And if the kids aren't all right, neither are the adults. So I'm just going to challenge everybody, whatever your nationality is, whatever your race is, understand your history. Get to know your history so well. Understand who you are, because if you do not name yourself, define yourself, you will constantly be looking for someone to validate who you are. I'm done, Councilwoman.
In all of this, the person who I keep coming back to is, because I think that we convince ourselves that these conversations or these types of actions, like what happened with Dr. Gay, are, bad but workable, or it's not as bad as it could be in the broader narrative. And the person who I keep coming back to in the conversation is Antoinette Candia Bailey, who was the vice president of student affairs at Lincoln University of Missouri, who was subjected to harassment and sabotage in her role, repeatedly wrote for accommodations due to mental health and other struggles, and was denied them, received an abysmal evaluation with no explanation of why her marks were so low, was eventually terminated from her role, and subsequently committed suicide. And the white president over her, who was the source of her struggles and the harassment and sabotage against her, where it was known that that was happening, voluntarily, and it's not funny, but I can't help but laugh at the fact that he was allowed to voluntarily step down or go on administrative leave while they looked into it, because he wanted the focus not to be on him as they tried to uncover what may have happened, and because it was so traumatic to him that this person killed themselves as a result of what he has still not really acknowledged as his own actions. And to me, that's really kind of the heart of this type of conversation. Is this is not just power systems that we're struggling against. It's not just attempts to dismantle our departments or our functions within academia or our roles or our leadership within these things, but it ultimately comes down to the undervaluing of, and ultimately in some cases, the loss of our lives in these struggles. And that to me is part of the white supremacist culture movement that we're living within right now. And I really want to be clear, because as we're speaking to our community here, and the caution that I have to exercise in those conversations because of my role within the community, because of my other work and other things that I do, I know that there is a level of caution and carefulness that I have to bring to conversations like this because of the response to it, of people saying that because I'm talking about white supremacy, I don't like white people. And that is not the narrative. It's that ability to personalize the systematic issues that we're talking about and dismantle the conversation because of that. But I really want us to hone in on that struggle, the fact that this is more than a fight for our positions or our places within society. It is often very much a fight for our lives. And that's a part of the conversation that doesn't often come up because in the case of someone like Dr. Gay, there is the narrative of, well, she stepped down, so it's over. We don't have to really talk about it anymore. And the fact is, no, she was systemically denied her livelihood in the way that Antoinette Candia Bailey was denied her life. So it's all related and it's part of that same narrative. And I think it's worth just talking about and spending some time there. So I'd like to open it up to the floor on just what is the real situation and struggle that we're talking about when we talk about situations like this.
Can I talk a little bit about what it's going to cost? In the last couple of months, we have had several Black female presidents who have dropped dead in their positions. One of them was eulogizing another person, and they believe she died on stage. She was carried off stage, and then they pull another Black woman on stage to continue the proceedings. Meanwhile, she's, and I believe she was serving as interim. There was another president, they called her Dr. O, and I wish I could remember the college right now. But when she was described, they talked about her service to students and how she was like, well, if it won't get done, I'll do it. And then there are the other ways that you kind of die in higher ed, or really just any industry that you're working in, because this is not just localized to higher ed. But for those of us who do survive the Phyllis Wheatley moment, what it costs the institution is innovation and intellect and brilliance, because a lot of us aren't around here second guessing our capability or our intelligence. We are weary of the try. Why would I put myself out here when you couldn't even protect my family? Why would I put myself out here when you didn't even care if I could make my mortgage or rent? And the performative caring that we did while we were locked down, we're teaching each other how to make bread via Zoom. We're meeting people where they are. We have become super flexible. It feels like all of that has turned. And if you are a hyper visible body, now you're being questioned. Once you were applauded for your ability to kind of make lemonade out of lemons in this lockdown situation, and now you're being questioned, and being questioned in ways that none of your other counterparts are being questioned. And then every day you're dying a little bit, plotting your escape from whatever industry that you're in. So the real cost to these industries, as we start to wake up as a Black womanhood to say, I deserve ease, I deserve a soft life. No, I'm not quiet quitting, I'm just gonna quit. Is you're losing the solutions to these problems that you say that you want. And not because we don't care, but because I got to choose me. Audre Lorde said that self-care is a radical act. It means my preservation, because these systems are not designed for us to think that way. And for the colored girl who did consider suicide when these institutions and these degrees were not enough, I also want to just say, we see you. Everybody has had that moment, and everybody has grappled with mental well-being. I won't say mental health, I'm going to say mental well-being. The dread that you feel when you have to get up and go back to this same institution because your baby got to eat. I also want to tell you that there are solutions out there. We are not chained to the plantation, y'all. We have options. And so I'm constantly reminding Black women of their certifications, whatever those certifications are. If you are a stylist, you've got a cosmetology license. Girl, you can do stuff with that. If you're in academia and you got an advanced degree, you can do stuff like that. There is a whole cadre of Black women who are teaching us how to shift and use our brilliance in ways that allow us to bring our full selves to positions and spaces. But the cost, and even if you don't feel it now, like I said before, white supremacy costs everybody, not just the one who's invested in it. Dr. Roaf?
So much there. I'm gonna quote Auntie Maxine, because as Audre Lorde says, ease and pleasure and joy and all the different forms of pleasure is a radical act. And to me, that has to be founded in self-care. And Auntie Maxine talked about reclaiming her time. And part of us tapping into our genius, our innovation, our creativity, we are the harbingers and the setters of the whole culture all over the world as Black women. We know this. And so part of that is, like Dr. Treya is saying, tapping into our gifts, figuring out a variety of avenues of divesting from the plantation, divesting from the institutions in the sense of not being, not drinking the Kool-Aid. And for me, I would say my work, and the reason why I'm here with you all at Live Black Experience, where these sisters are my literal sisters. This space has become a true community for me, and it is opened up an expansion of my family by choice. And so what also keeps me going is drawing from and building upon the long-standing practice of Ubuntu, right? Of upholding myself and each one of us as individuals, and valuing that as much as we value the collective that we make up. And everywhere that I go, that's been my saving grace, is I always connect with community within the institution, outside of it. I step back. I reclaim my time. I reclaim my energy. I've gone through a number of Phyllis Wheatley moments, and I was definitely immersed in one last year. And I decided this year, I am not going to be the mule and the scapegoat simultaneously for this institution anymore. And when I tell you the ancestors are working and just clearing that path, all of the above, and really full circle, for me, it's about the beloved community. And that is how I'm able to keep going. And that is what gives me joy. And like my students are what bring me that joy. And I do the work based on true connection and true collaboration, regardless of title, regardless of position or positionality, regardless of affiliation. And conversely, I don't care what someone's title is. I don't care what their position is. When you know who you are, you know who you are. We know that we are the empresses, that we are the prototype of modern humanity. And I'm sitting back on my throne. I'm sitting back on my throne. And you will not be in my presence, and I will dismiss you from my courts if you don't come correct, and if you don't engage and participate actively in a mutual exchange of love through respect and honoring the full humanity before you and within you. That's where I am now. You are dismissed, because I got peoples. I got my tribes. I got my ancestors here on this side of the veil and the other. That's how I keep going.
That whole final quote from you, Dr. Roaf. I just need that whole thing on a shirt. You're dismissed from my courts. Yes, I love it. I know we are beyond our normal time, and I thank you both for, and actually all three of you, for being part of this conversation and engaging in this. The last question, and it will be our closer, is it is Black History Month 2024. And we have talked about radical Black joy. We've talked about self-care as resistance. What does this year's celebration need to look like in light of these types of conversations? How do we celebrate or commemorate Black History Month in 2024 in light of these struggles that we're facing as a community, and particularly as a Black women's community?
Kara, one more time. I have so many thoughts, and I'm like, shh, let me listen one more time.
Yeah, just in light of the situations that particularly Black women, but just the Black community also is facing in 2024, what does it look like for us to celebrate Black History Month this month? How do we celebrate or commemorate this month in this year and in this time?
Okay, so I don't know an answer to that, but I can tell you what I have decided to do. Sometime like between December and January, I had this conversation. You know, you just sit up and you talk to yourself, and you almost have to have that girl get up conversation, because you're too tired to pray, you're too tired to call people. And I'm really grateful for my tribe, because they just pop up and they're like, hey, you walked across my mind, what's going on? But I had this moment where I was like, I don't have to wait for y'all to get it. I'm gonna go out here and get it. Who can I partner with? How can I bring African American studies to the public and not just institutions? So what I decided to do was, I'm going to partner. I was like, oh, I'm partnering with the public librarians here in Tucson. And we are going to do a programming called Reading Black Lives, which every month we are going to read or explore some aspect of Black humanity that is not rooted in oppression. So whether it's learning about Elizabeth Catlett, who was a sculptor, whether it's learning about Alice Ball, who actually was the person, a Black chemist who cured leprosy, but her name wasn't on the paper, whether it's learning about Vivian Thomas, who never was allowed to go to medical school because he couldn't afford it, but instructed doctors on how to cure and how to operate on blue baby syndrome. Oh, we gonna learn about some stuff this year, because ultimately learning and celebrating Black history means you gotta learn it, right? And not just the stuff where we like, oh, we sure was oppressed, but even in that oppression, we found innovative ways to cultivate a culture that everybody finds profitable today. And so I had this moment where I was like, girl, get up. You got these degrees, go on and hook up with somebody. And I want to say this, public libraries are like the last place of education that is not hidden behind a paywall, and might be the last great defender of democracy. So if you are not a member of your public library, even if you just go in and check out an audiobook, I need for us all to do that. If you just want to participate. And also while you're there, learn about the Black librarians who were community builders, who taught people how to read, not just the enslaved or the newly freed, but also, I mean, like adult learners who were kicked out of school and couldn't figure out how they were going to like make it. Black librarians, y'all, they are a powerful bunch. And in saying that, I just want to say Cheryl Neal, who is my Black librarian, is bomb.com.
I'm going to add to what Dr. Treya said, going out to the community and circling back around to, I'm focusing on the younger generations as a young elder, as a living ancestor. So I'm very excited because not only do I work intensively with students in several of our classes for our event at Stan State, but I'm going to have the opportunity to go and connect with high school students at one of the local high schools, actually the high school, Pittman High School, where Colin Kaepernick attended. So there's like an irony and a sweetness and a full circle to that, because I know I'm so excited about it. I know in my mind, I'm going to be imagining, what if there's a Colin Kaepernick who is attending that high school now? What if there are a number of Colin Kaepernicks? I'm not talking about his athletic prowess. I'm talking about his critical consciousness and his activism. And I'm just beyond the moon and stars to be able to really, really prioritize working not only with college students, but also high school students this Black History Month.
Dr. Lewis, do you want to close us out?
Yes, thank you. I love the fact that this space provides not only education and enlightenment and information, many times new to most of our viewers and supporters, but it's also a space for healing. And for that, I'm very grateful. And as we sit in a time right now where many women of color, particularly those of African descent, in higher education, are being labeled as being or presumed as incompetent or being too difficult, being too hard, setting too high of expectations upon students. I am grateful that we can have these two sisters to come in and to give us renewed strength and expectations, because now we have moved beyond hope. We are at a level of expectations that we have paid enough dues, and we're still waiting on one big check that is yet to be cashed. And so this is Black History Month, where we are celebrating our accomplishments, our achievements. We're obtaining our dreams and planning and asking for support and upliftment in those things that we want to achieve. As we close out this evening, I would like to dedicate this live stream this evening to Dr. Joanne A. Epps of Temple University and Dr. Orinthia T. Montague of Volunteer State Community College, two sisters who we can safely say, we can be confident in saying that they lost their lives due to stress in trying to educate the minds of the future. And it was just a few short months before Dr. Epps passed away that she said, our dedication to access, diversity, and inclusivity remains unshaken. And so I sit here and I'm very honored and proud to be a part of this Lived Black Experience project, that though we may experience opposition and criticism. And after tonight, we might be on lists, watch lists. I applaud our courage and unity and our bravery to come and to speak truth while sitting in power. And so, with that being said, it looks like it's going to be a wonderful and eventful 2024. And we thank all of our viewers. We thank our sisters who never think it an imposition to come and to share with us. We are grateful always for our resident facilitator, Dr. Oh, well, I must be speaking something over you, Sister Kara House. And I have to acknowledge and bow down to the pearls that she's wearing this evening. And those pearls symbolize rooted groundness, a reminder that we stay and sit and maintain our grace and our poise under pressure and while going through the fires of change and challenge. And so thank you to all of you. Happy Black History Month. And Black History Month is everyone's opportunity to celebrate being a part of these United States of America. With that being said, go in grace.